We'd like to study with you on the subject of this day, and that is pray for one another. Pray for one another. I want to use that as our subject matter, but I want to share with you that in the Bible, especially the New Testament, throughout there, God has given us some kind of indication of how Christians ought to treat one another. And so he used certain terms to express that idea by using the connection of those two words, one another. Let me give you an idea of what we mean before we get to the text that we like to look at. Let's check the book. In the book of Romans chapter 12, if you would, around verse number 10, watch the use of that idea, one another, in respect to how we ought to treat one another. Let's check the book. In the book of Romans chapter 12, around verse number 10, Paul writes these words. He says, "Be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love, preferring," he says, "one another." And the idea here is that we ought to show one another a certain kind of respect. And there ought to be a certain kind of harmony that exists between us. Let's again check the book. In Romans again, chapter 12, around verse 16, he utters these words. He says, "Be of the same mind," watch this, "one toward another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of" what? "Low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits." Be ready, he says in some words, to adjust to people that you associate with, and especially the Christians. For we are not always right in our viewpoint sometimes. Let's again quickly check the book. In the book of Galatians chapter 5, around verse number 13, this expression is used here also. Let's check the book. Galatians chapter 5. Around verse number 13, listen to what the Bible says. Paul writes and he says, "For brethren, ye have been called unto liberty, and use not your liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but watch this, but love, serve one another." And so again, the idea is we ought to serve, be useful to one another, wait on one another. And sometimes, without question, we ought to allow the other folk to have their way instead of ours. As he said in one particular passage, we ought to prefer others over ourselves. Let's check the book. In the book of Ephesians chapter 4, around verse number 2, watch what the Bible says. Ephesians chapter 4, around verse number 2. Listen to what the great book says. Around verse number 2, he says these words: "With all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering," know what you do? "Forbearing one another," watch this now, "forbearing one another in love." And the idea here is that we need to make allowances for others' faults. You see, sometimes we're going to make mistakes. And so with meekness and with kindness and with long suffering, that ought to enable us to make some allowances for one another. But the text that I want to share with you, study with you today, comes from James chapter 5. And the thought that I want to raise now for a little while, and that is, with all the things that he says, and sometimes we take this for granted. We say it, but do we really mean it? And do we really do it? And that is, we ought to pray, church, for one another. Let's check the book. In the book of James, if you would, chapter 5, I want you to note verse number 16. And let's notice what the Bible says. Let's check the book. In James chapter 5, around verse number 16, James utters these words. He says, "Confess your faults one to another, and watch us, pray one for another, that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." Church, if there's anything that we ought to do, certainly, besides love, and there's a number of items that he mentioned, we ought to pray for one another, because there's power in prayer. Let's check the book. At verse number 13 in the same text, I want to stop there and let's notice what the Bible says. In James 5, around verse number 13, he says this: Is any among you afflicted? Let him what? Pray. Now watch this, church. The word afflicted has reference to a suffering, difficulty in regard to our circumstances. And there may be some circumstances that occur that are very difficult, and the idea is that we may suffer through those things, and that's the idea of the term or the word affliction. Now, what affliction can do, and suffering through difficult circumstances, which is the same idea, what it can do, it can either cause us to be strengthened, and as a result of that, be blessed and become stronger, or God may allow that affliction to subside or be taken away. Again, I'm going to say this here. What afflictions do for us, that is suffering through difficult circumstances, it may allow God, in so many words, to show his grace by allowing this thing to help us go through it and make us stronger and more patient and more dedicated to the Lord, or the Lord may just take it away. But let's, for the moment, church, check the book. In the book of James, if you would, again, around chapter 4, and the verse number 6, let's notice what the Bible says. James chapter 4, around verse number 6. Earlier, James writes these words. He says, around verse number 6, but he giveth more grace. Watch this now. He giveth more grace, more favor, more benefit. Wherefore, he said, God resisteth the right, proud, but giveth what? Grace unto the humble. And so there are some favor, there are some benefit that the Lord gives to those that are humble. Let's check the book. In the book of 2 Corinthians, around chapter 12, around verse number 7, let's check the book. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, we begin around verse number 7. Notice what the Bible says. In chapter 12, beginning around verse number 7, the Apostle Paul writes these words. He says, unless I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. Paul says, I prayed 3 times, specifically in regard to the thorn, the suffering and difficult circumstance that the Lord placed upon me. And he said unto me, my what? Grace, my favor, my benefit to you is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, Paul says, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure, he says now, in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, he says, then am I strong. And so, as James writes and he says, if any among you who are afflicted, you ought to pray. Why? Because prayer can change things. That is, prayer talks to God, communicates to God, and God changes things. But it can be certainly through the avenue of prayer.